Good evening. Welcome to the Wednesday, September 11th, 2019 meeting of the Moscow Planning and Zoning Commission. And we'll begin with item 1 on the agenda, which is approval of the minutes from August 28th. Are there any additions, corrections, deletions on the minutes?
Looks good to me.
You want to?
Motion to approve the minutes?
Second.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Victoria. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Okay. Item 2, public comment. We have some visitors in the audience. This is an opportunity for members of the public to speak to the commission regarding items that aren't currently on our agenda or pending before us. Is anyone here wishing to speak or no?
You want to tell us where you might be from?
We all have the same class and we have to...
Is it urban theory?
What was that?
Is it urban theory?
No, integrated politics.
Oh, okay, different one. I used to teach one that's...
Intergovernmental relationships,
Yeah.
and we
Oh,
just
great.
have to basically go to the meeting and write about it.
Welcome.
Welcome, yeah.
Good to
Okay.
see you.
What's that? I already did last time. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I can reintroduce her, but I introduced her at the last meeting. Okay, well, thank you. Welcome. Okay, our next item is citizen survey questions. Hopefully everybody's had a bit of chance to look again. And so this we had talked last time about shortening the drop-down list from one of the questions, and this one, yeah, there we go, about neighborhood characteristics, and then we also had discussed trying to come up with one about climate change. So over the last few weeks, I've drafted several, sent them back and forth to Rob and Mike and Victoria for feedback, and then back and forth with Mike a bit, and Mike sort of recombined some of the questions into one, but here it is, so take a look and see what you think.
I sure like the third one, especially myself. I realize that using the word density, it's so poorly understood or badly understood
Right.
by a lot of people. So I think questions that don't necessarily use density, but a mixture of land uses is one that I really enjoy trying to talk about.
Yeah, and I know I hear what you're saying, Nels, because density is, I used to tell my students not to use the D word when they were talking to communities because it scares them. But it's a way, in a sense, of saying, in order to have what you might want in terms of supported multiple modal transportation, you need that density to go with it. So
the inference is there.
Well, it'll be interesting to see,
Right.
It'll be interesting to see how people respond to it. But the idea would be to range it right from strongly agree to strongly disagree, and on each one of the ideas. But and we also, there was a question from Rob about there's sort of a shift going from not just mitigating the effects of climate change, but accepting it's already upon us, and also having adaptation strategies. And so that the idea here was to kind of mix them together, different types of strategies that make sense for community planning in other ways as well, that also help mitigate and adapt. So
Do we know, on the last question, the one of the parking, do we have even a vague handle on how many people drive in from, let's say, more than 3 or 4 miles that would, you do wonder if you could find a place to, kind of as the university does with students, to be able to park and have a shuttle running back and forth every 15 minutes, so that if people needed to get their car at some point, they don't have to wait.
Well, what would make sense to me in that aspect is as our transit system talks about expanding their routes or their hours or whatever, including that parking lot or wherever it is as part of the route would make sense, at least at the beginning. To me, I don't know how much leverage we have, but that.
I just wonder how
Yeah.
many, if we have a vague sense of how many people drive into, from someplace more than, outside of the area of impact, I guess I would say, that don't feel like they're really exactly the community, and yet at least virtually all my friends who live on Moscow Mountain feel just like I do about the town. I mean, it's their town, and yet they're over there.
One model I was just thinking about that we have for that idea, in a sense of what you're talking about, is the university has tiered parking, but it's remote parking. You can't park right next to where you're working.
Right.
So there is a culture of parking and walking in,
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. And for people who live in Troy but people who live in Moscow. Yeah.
Well, a gentleman who worked for me his bicycle was the back of his pickup. He'd drive in, park in the Safeway parking lot, and then do everything he did in town, and he worked for me, off his bicycle. And then at night, he'd ride back out there, throw it in the pickup, and drive out, and he lived out on Paradise Mountain.
Yeah.
The parking area that gives the ability then to use a different mode of transportation, I think is a wonderful idea. Where the parking is at a premium a lot of places already.
Yeah, I think when there used to be the shuttle to Pullman, just anecdotally, I know of a lot of people that would park in the mall parking lot. I don't know if they were supposed to or not, but they would park there and then the shuttle there, and their car would stay there all day. So there was that demand. I don't know of any data to answer that question of how many people are
Yeah, I don't know how
doing
you
that and where are they leaving
really
their cars.
find it out. It's a little probably tricky, and yet I'm often, it seems like our town's just a little place, and yet when you drive over, if you have to go over to a doctor or somebody in Pullman, it just seems like there's a lot of toing and froing, a lot. I mean, it's never an empty road, so you do wonder if that could work, if that could be something useful.
Yeah, really the only way I think to get any type of numbers is just traffic counts, at certain times of the day, and traffic counters, and see how many people are driving in, but then you don't know how they're dispersed, whether they're going to Pullman or they're going south or north.
Right.
It's kind of hard to tell, but you can figure out how many are actually, coming in during the commuter hours.
So who does those and how often?
Well, the city does counts. ITD would likely do the ones on the highway. So we get Highway 8 coming into town, and they probably have, counts within the last couple of years to take a look at.
And I could get that information on the Washington side because we gleaned all that information when we were looking to build out there.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So
Yeah. So what do you think in terms of this as the second question?
I like it.
So these are the two questions with just all these drop downs in each one, correct?
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So these would be the potential answers that people could give
Okay.
where they agree or disagree, and the question is in the bolder part.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is the feeling that, and where you and Rob talked about in Victoria, the feeling that these questions differentiate enough from what's been asked 2 years ago or 4 years ago that would glean us better, more current information?
Well,
Because it appears to, but.
yeah, hopefully, I mean, it's trying to target land use in various ways. And we don't really have anything in our repertoire on climate change specifically, I don't believe, because the city just really went to adopting the policy. When was that, Brandy? Like in last winter, right? Like last spring. Agreeing to, you could explain it better than I can, but agreeing to move forward on examining or taking a stand for the city policy or whatever.
Do you mean specifically about climate change? Or
Yeah, I mean, I was here giving a report for one of my commissions when you all were discussing it.
yeah, I think what you're referring to is when we had a discussion about time to kind of re-look at updates to the strategic plan.
Right.
And that was one of the things
Right.
that we discussed.
Okay,
It's not, hasn't been determined yet but it was a discussion of climate change potentially being identified as a new major challenge area, which it is not currently in this strategic plan. Sometime within the next month is my understanding that there will be the workshop really to address the strategic plan, and that's when we will be talking about, will that be added?
Because it was
Let's-
when Mac Cantrell and Mary Dupree came and gave a
Oh, yeah.
presentation that was what I was talking about. So I happened to be here for that one. And that was a while ago, but
Yeah, so,
Yeah.
and that was about the ordinance supporting action for carbon fee and dividend type proposals, and that was unanimously adopted by the council, recommended by Sustainable Environment Commission, and the mayor signed on to that. And so there's certainly been in the last year interest and momentum for addressing climate change issues coming
So
from the
this-
city of Moscow.
so whatever we find out from this could be helpful to several commissions would be the point, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I like how each one of them is, you can see a direct connection to something that planning and zoning has a role in with that information
Yeah.
that comes out. You know, there are things that planning and zoning can have an effect on.
Okay, do we need to vote on, oh, and let's look at the other one
Yeah, and
real
then the
quick.
other one,
Yeah.
it really hasn't changed from what we looked at last time, I don't think.
This is more about neighborhood character, yeah. So.
Yeah. I say go with it.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay,
I like both
Okay.
questions.
great, okay, we'll do that then. Everybody pretty much in agreement? Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, sounds good. All right, item 4, a review of potential changes to the sign code for compliance with the Supreme Court case of Reid versus Town of Gilbert.
It's like an Arizona deal.
Yeah, so this is something that's been on our radar for some time. As with any Supreme Court decision, there's always various other cases that come after that decision, and so we were kind of just waiting until some of those cases played out. But various other communities are starting to amend their sign codes to be compliant with this Supreme Court case, and so that's what we're attempting to do here. So I'll kind of go through the beginning with just kind of the structure of sign codes that really vary by municipality, but there's common elements to pretty much all sign codes. There's definitions of sign types, so we have like monument signs, freestanding signs, wall signs. Those are typically all defined within municipal sign codes. They have prohibited sign types, permitted sign types, so a lot of it depends on what zoning district you're in. For instance, motor business, I think, is the only zone that allows roof signs. were deemed that they weren't appropriate in any other zone. Downtown, we don't allow LED, like dynamic display signs, just because of the historical character of downtown. The council determined that they really just don't fit in, but they're more appropriate along the highway corridors. So a lot of it depends on the zone where they're at, and then the kind of the time, place, and manner limitations that apply to permitted sign types. So a lot of municipalities, including ours, like political signs. You can only put it out 60 days in advance of the election. You got to take it down 7 days after the election. Real estate signs, that's another type of sign that are commonly regulated. So there's area, height, setbacks, number, lighting, spacing, and a lot of that just depends on what zone you're in. If you're in a more automobile-oriented zone along the highway corridors, then you're allowed larger signage. Just because of the scale of the automobile is different than the pedestrian scale of downtown. We used to only allow sandwich board signs downtown, but you started to see a lot of those show up on the highway corridors, and then they kind of morphed into the larger feather signs that you see in businesses as well. So a lot of it's just really directed towards the makeup of the area where the sign's at. Then there's prohibitions or special rules for new billboards. We don't necessarily have any special rules for billboards here other than they're limited by distance, and they're usually declared a freestanding sign. There's a few billboards around town, and that's likely the greatest number that we'll be able to see. There's only a few based upon our spatial guidelines. There's probably only a couple other areas where you would actually be allowed to put a billboard up. But some communities have just essentially banned billboards outright, just because they're maybe scenic corridors. I know when I lived in Park City area, they had banned billboards just because of the view sheds of the mountains and the natural areas from the highway corridors. And then the sign types that are exempt from permitting. So a lot of times the government will exempt themselves. Obviously if there's a directional sign, the city doesn't need to come in and get a permit from our office in order to be able to do that. Temporary signs are used to be exempt. We really don't require a permit for those. And then there's a few other types of signs that are exempt as well, like directional signs. If you're in like drive-through, as long as they don't have a advertisement for the business and it's just more directional into the parking lot or the drive-through, they'll say enter here, exit here. We don't have menu board signs, that go through drive-throughs. Those are exempt as well within our sign code. There's usually a purpose statement, location-specific sign regulations. So almost always residential zones, there's tighter controls. And then there's exemptions for entertainment or other high-intensity zones. Unique rules for special areas of special character, such as corridors and planned developments. So downtown, we have limitations on certain types of signs, like I'd mentioned before, the dynamic display signs. And then there's usually restrictions on digital or changing signs. I think Tri-State was the catalyst for that ordinance
We had a
change.
bunch of near auto accidents when that first was installed. Yeah.
Those are now limited in size. And then rules for temporary signs. We see a lot of temporary signs. So this really all just ties back to the First Amendment, where government shall make no law, respecting the establishment of religion or prohibition of free exercise thereof, or the abridging of freedom of speech or the press. So it really comes down to just a freedom of speech issue with signage. So we get to the Reid versus Town of Gilbert case. So the plaintiffs were really a homeless church, Pastor Reid and its members. And so homeless, I mean that they don't have a building of their own. They just met in places that were available to them. And they use temporary directional signs to guide people to their weekly services. And then the defendant is in Arizona. I think it's an outskirt of Phoenix. And large town, 75 square miles, 208,000 residents as of the 2010 census. And this was the issue. So they had, the church had similar signs to these here, temporary signs. And then you also saw various other political real estate signs that were of the similar nature. And if you looked at their regulations, there was different sizes for different types of signs. So you could have a homeowners association sign that was probably larger than the rest of these. Then you had political signs, ideological signs, and then qualifying kind of special event signs. And it was just based upon that specific group, you got a different size. And so non-political, non-ideological, non-commercial event signs limited to 6 square feet in size. They could only show it or display it for 12 hours before until 1 hour after an event. And then political temporary signs go all the way up to 32 square feet, non-residential zones, 60 days before and then 15 days after the election. And then ideological signs could be larger, 20 square feet, than qualifying event signs, but not as big as political signs in non-residential zone. And then they could be displayed for an unlimited period of time, but they couldn't be displayed in the right-of-way. So Reid was cited for a sign code violation in 2005. They sued in 2007, which was unsuccessful in getting a court to enjoin Gilbert.
What did they do? What did the little church do? Have too many signs or too big?
I think they were having too many of them was the issue, putting those around town, and then I think they were a little bit larger than they were typically allowed.
So they were trying to guide people to wherever they were on any given Sunday, huh?
Yeah, they were, and then I think they were probably sued for some type of discrimination because all the other entities were allowed much larger signs than they were, and that was part of it. So, the town of Gilbert prevailed 4 times before reaching the U.S. Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court sided with Reid. So the court clarified once and for all what it means for such regulations to be content-based, and reiterate the court's longstanding rule that content-based regulations are subject to strict scrutiny. Strict scrutiny apparently is the highest standard, and if you go to the Supreme Court with a strict scrutiny case, then you're almost always, I think, going to lose in that circumstance. So unable to discern any compelling governmental interest in differing rules adopted by the town, the court found the ordinance invalid. So they pretty much determined that there was no really compelling interest why you would have different size signs for those different types of entities that were displaying them. So what the ruling means is that any site and ordinance with different rules for different categories of signs is content-based, as long as the categories are defined by the content, topic, or subject matter of the sign's message. So, we have an ordinance that allows political signs to be 12 square feet, but limits temporary directional signs 6 square feet. That's content-based because you have to look at the sign to determine what type of sign it is. It's not just a freestanding sign where they all look similar. You actually have to read the sign to determine, and that's kind of the test, and whether it's content-based or not. So, in an ordinance that prohibits signs without a permit, but provides an exception to this permit requirement for historical markers, real estate signs, and address signs would also be content-based as well. So as a result of the court case, the sign code is now to be content neutral, and pretty much, every municipality that has sign codes needs to eliminate separate rules for categories of signs that are defined by the content or subject matter of the message. So avoiding rules that have different size, height, duration requirements for political, directional, real estate signs, which we currently do. So they also wanted you to take a look at the exceptions to regulations to make sure they're not content-based. So even if their exceptions just seem innocuous, so historical marker, address signs, and we have a number of exceptions for Like I mentioned, the drive-through, directional signs. We have, historical markers, signs displayed on behalf of government, which are still legal, but I think you need to word them a little bit differently. But, with that being said, the rules that are not content-based that we can still regulate signs on are the size, location, whether or not they're lighted, unlighted, internally lighted, exterior lighted, signs with fixed messages and electronic, placements of signs on public-private property, commercial and residential property, and then distinguishing between on-premise and off-premise signs. So, that would mean that somebody else gets a sign, puts it on somebody else's property, but it's directing them to a business or, an entity that's not on that property would be an off-premise sign. Total number of signs per mile of roadway. So some regulations within our code, like the feather signs, you're only permitted a certain number for every certain amount of feet that you have frontage on a street right-of-way. Rules.
Do you mind telling me what's a feather sign?
It's like the ones that look like a giant feather. So they have like a
so
post,
they're kind of on a stand,
a stick
on a post
coming, post
okay.
coming up, and then it's usually
Yes.
a fabric type sign.
Okay.
Rules imposing time restrictions on signs, advertising a one-time event. And the government itself may put up all manner of signs to promote safety, as well as directional signs and signs pointing out historic sites and scenic spots. So that's largely unchanged, that the government's allowed to put up those signs as long as they tie back to, promoting pretty much the interest of the community. So, in looking at our sign code, obviously we have political campaign signs. We currently limit the size depending upon whether it's in residential or commercial zones. Commercial zones, you're allowed a lot larger of a sign, like, a lot larger of a property typically, and you're usually automobile-oriented size. And then contains posting and removal time frame. I think ours is 60 days before and 7 days after the election. Real estate signs, those are exempt from getting a permit, so are political signs. We really have a sliding scale for size depending upon zoning district. So the more intense the zone, usually the larger of a real estate sign that you're able to display. And then we do have exempt signs. So this is one, directional warning, street, building identification, traffic control, informational, utility location identification, or temporary special event. And then we've got the parking lot entry, exit, traffic directional signs. So, based upon this, with not being able to regulate the content, a lot of other jurisdictions are taking these approaches. And so like in residential zones, you think about people that have the standard, like free speech signs. It could be that we're welcoming of our neighbors. You see a lot of these around town that are just more of a display of their viewpoints towards something in life. And, typically those aren't listed as any type of sign. They're a temporary sign in our sign code, but really they're not listed as any type of temporary sign. They wouldn't fit.
You're kind of thinking about the ones that say, we accept people who speak any language or have any faith.
Completely.
And so
Yeah.
it looks like it's a size of a political sign. They've
Sure.
just taken political signs and put something else on it.
Totally. Yep.
Are we allowed to do that now?
Well,
Or have I been in trouble all these months?
it's really, I guess, silent right now. Nobody's ever gotten in trouble for one, but I don't know that they're,
Yeah, I never
they're
thought
not-
about it because
yeah.
we take down the political sign immediately, but we've left up our little three-color sign. We did until we built the pocket park, and then we
So the approach to address all of this, really, political signs, real estate signs, and those types of signs, are that every property has a particular amount of square feet of signage that they can use for any temporary non-commercial signs on their property. So an example, a certain number of, maybe it's 6 square feet per lot in residential zones with a limit on the size of the signs and the spacing of signs from one another. So that really doesn't identify, it just gives everybody the right to 6 square feet, however you choose to
So
display
they've got to be more
that.
selective in their political,
Well, it's
some
still a
people-
free speech issue, right? I mean, it's still free speech, so, I mean, pretty much put mostly anything out there, I guess, unless it's too inflammatory. And then all properties get a base amount of temporary non-commercial signs year-round, additional signs at certain times. So, it's weird because
Yeah, there we go.
they're directed towards these certain events, but we're not saying that. It's pretty much just required our sign codes to not say what they're for, but still allow them in a roundabout way is what it does. So, certain times a year, so for particular periods of time, right before an election, properties get more signs. And then for particular periods of time, all size and number restrictions on signs are suspended. So, maybe 60 days prior to an election and 7 days after, you have unlimited temporary sign potential on your property is how that would be addressed, because
Wasn't there something about duration, though? You couldn't specify different duration for different content? in
you
that
can,
ruling?
but we wouldn't be doing that here. It would
Okay.
just be a temporary sign is what we would call it. Is what it's called now is temporary sign, but then they have the subcategories, which are political, real estate, those types of signs. So we're not saying it's a specific type of sign, but we're allowing for political signs, pretty much to display a certain, unlimited number, or could be a certain number of those during a certain time of year. And in a roundabout way, it's allowing political signs just because you're allowed to display more 60 days prior or up to 7 days after the election is what it would do.
So a real estate sign would not be considered a commercial sign then? It would be considered non-commercial?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yep. And then allow an extra sign on property that's currently for sale or for rent.
In addition to the X square feet, you mean? Okay.
I mean, we could do whatever we wanted, but I think that, I think those are kind of separate, the temporary signs for political and real estate. And then obviously, you could have those and then somebody might be selling their house at the same time. So they're a little bit different. And then,
Could you get into an issue question? If they were selling their tractor, their car, whatever, does that matter? I don't know, I'm asking.
Like a yard sale?
Well,
Something like that, yeah.
Take your for sale sign down during the yard sale.
yeah. Well, I mean, it would just fall under if we, chose to just allow one non-commercial sign of 6 square feet in size.
Okay.
I mean, that would cover it if they were selling, something out front. It hasn't been a high priority to go around and talk to people about these types of signs. But, it would,
I don't know why I
that
thought
would
of
be
it,
the
just
goal is to try to cover it underneath kind of the blanket
Yeah,
regulations of just the total number of total amount of signage on each lot.
What did Reid get out of this? What did they want to do that they, I can't seem to ferret that out. Somebody tell me. Reid was putting signs up to say, we're meeting over here today.
Yeah,
And there's a bunch of signs coming, heading to that, and did they want bigger signs or more signs?
Well, it's probably the number of signs, and then the town of Gilbert went and regulated them on, how many signs they were displaying, and then they pointed to all these other signs that were saying, hey, they can display all these, and they're that much larger, and
They had
it's
all
a
those
free
signs, all the
speech.
church members would be out putting up signs instead of being at church.
Well,
were
it's a
suing in
different,
response to
yeah,
being
it's,
cited
yeah,
by the- They were suing in response to being cited by the city,
Correct.
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But they had to go out and put signs up to before they recited. Yeah.
Well, I think, this day and age, it was different. I mean, this is back in 2005. I think now you would have a Facebook group, or you'd have a website that sent out a message, email, listserv to all your members,
Took all
letting
these years to
them,
get to the
letting them
Supreme
know,
Court, huh?
where they're meeting. So I think it's, technology and times have changed a little bit, but nonetheless, it created the Supreme Court case that, kind of decided this. So then I think the more challenging one, we'll have to add, extra sign area or extra allowances of signs for lots that have kind of the drive-through window or, like directional signs that we exempt right now. We'll have to insert language in there, and if, may or may not need to distinguish between businesses that have a drive-through or, gas station or car wash, really the uses that
Well, it's also
need
places
directional signage.
that have a queue too,
yeah.
like we ran into the problem with Dutch Brothers.
Yeah.
And so we needed a bunch of, to allow.
Queuing
yeah,
spaces.
Yeah.
Well, there must be cities that have developed new ordinances based on this court case. Should we be looking at them for
Sure.
examples?
Sure. Yeah, I can, I was just planning on kind of introducing the case and going over our issues, but, yeah, we'll go ahead and do some research and then bring some examples back and put it in ordinance form and then kind of go through it, but.
So how did this come down through the state of Idaho? I mean, from the Supreme Court, how did you find out about it?
Well, it's just, anytime you have a major Supreme Court case that affects a planning-related matter, then it's more just the American Planning
It just goes
Association
everywhere? Okay.
that, yeah.
Okay.
It gets distributed through the APA is typically. But yeah, and so you go to conferences and you have sign people there, lawyers that work for sign companies that, pretty much say you gotta change your rules right now. And I mean, really the only, if we were to get sued, would be really the only, issue that we would have. It's out of compliance right now, but we're working to bring it into compliance. But typically we haven't run into any issues with signs like that, so. So we were planning on, just taking a look at some changes, having a legal department review, and then bring back to the commission at an upcoming meeting, and then we can certainly do a little research and bring some examples of other sign codes where they made the changes, and then we could take a look at that and see what we want to do, but.
Sounds good. Okay, that's it? Okay. Next item is review the single electrical service for accessory dwelling units requirement, excuse me.
So these are really small, but I've combined kind of the covered parking space issue as well. And so these are kind of a couple minor issues that we've just ran into over the years, and kind of hard to read, but typically if you have a principal structure, so if you have a house on a property, we require that any accessory structure, so it could be a garage, shed, outbuilding, just really accessory structure required to be extended off the main house. So we don't allow separate electrical meters or separate water meters. And the reason historically for that has been that we want to reduce the likelihood of that ever being, rented out to somebody for a commercial use or turning into a dwelling. If it has a separate meter on it for water and electrical, the likelihood of that happening is a lot easier because they could just say, well, it's already separately metered. And so that's really been the main reason why we've required that. Accessory dwelling units are still an accessory use. And at the time when this was developed, you see the language here, so uses, it's at the very bottom. Uses, buildings, and structures that utilize electricity and or water and or accessory to a single family or duplex residence shall be serviced by the same electrical and or water meter as a single family or duplex residence. And then we added this in recently, so this was, I think, the use table amendment last year. We added in a part about the zoning administrator may allow separate meters in the event that the distance between the principal structure and the accessory structure is exceptionally long. So I know Scott's not here, but you know, there's been numerous circumstances where you have the main house and then maybe the garage or greenhouse or whatever it is 200 feet away. And there's a power pole 10 feet away from the greenhouse, and it just doesn't make any sense to require them to run, you know, these separate utilities 200 feet when they, you know, it's not that important. So we, you know, added that flexibility, but we wanted to talk about ADUs because they are allowed to be a separate dwelling. They're still intended to be accessory. But really the whole goal behind this is that, you know, if they create an ADU, really the intention is that it is separate dwelling. So we didn't really see any issue why we wouldn't allow a separate electrical meter, electrical connection. And also we've been running into issues where maybe you have a 200 amp service, and once you create an ADU and you run it from the main house panel with your 200 amp service, you essentially, you know, you have this 200 amp service and you look at your own home, the likelihood of you using everything in your home is pretty slim, all your appliances, lights. But when you have essentially two dwellings on the same service, you have one, you could have, you know, a couple people using, you know, living in that ADU and then a family in the main house. All of a sudden you're putting this substantial load and you may not have enough amperage to be able to run both.
Two
Everybody's
dryers going
got
at
hot
once,
water at the
yeah.
same time, we're all taking showers.
Yeah.
Together.
Everybody's
that,
roasting.
you have-
Dryers being a big
Dryer.
one.
Yeah, you have that issue, and then a lot of people are forced to upgrade their service and their panel, which isn't cheap. So, I mean, $5 to $8 grand, depending upon, you know, what it is. Most houses have 200 amp service. You know, you have to, it's not just replacing the panel, you have to run a 400 amp line to replace the 200 amp. So, you know, 5,000 to 8,000 just with the city, and then whatever Avista charges to run the additional service. For something that's intended to be another dwelling. And so we wanted to just bring that to you and talk about changing that for ADUs to allow a separate water and utility, you know, electrical connection on ADUs.
Makes sense to me. I don't know. Yeah.
And I think what we were planning on doing is just conducting a hearing on that and then just wrapping it up with our other ADU amendment. We haven't brought that to council yet. The commission's conducted the public hearing, but we were just going to tie those two together and just bring that to council in one swoop. But
Would it be a caveat that if, even though there was 2 meters, whether it be water or power, they're both a common billing address, so you don't get into the just renting out the additional structure to, I mean, is that where we want to go, or?
Well, we allow renting out, you know, we
Yeah.
just limit the number of people. You know, I think it's advantageous to have 2 addresses because emergency services want 2 addresses.
No, I
you know.
understand that, but I'm more concerned about the ability of the city and to cover and capture these fees.
Oh. Yeah.
Because I
it-
know how big a nightmare that gets to be just in a standard rental situation a lot of times.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. And I think that, we would treat it, I think, similarly to any other house that would have a meter on it. You know, if they don't pay the bill, then the water or power gets shut off, and the owner, you know, still being the owner of the property, has some say in that as well. But
I think from an energy discipline point of view, it makes sense to have that extra, have it separate, because if you're not, okay, you got this, it's a little house, but you just decide to leave the heater on all day even though you're gone, doesn't matter to me because it's on the house that we're tied into on their unit, rather than saying, gosh, if we turn off the heater while we're gone to work, we don't have to pay so much. So I think it certainly seems sensible.
Good point,
Yeah. No, I can't
Yeah,
see
or-
any,
Yeah,
I can't see any compelling reason for
yeah,
forcing a single meter.
yeah.
No, we have the owner occupancy requirement on the ADUs, and that's really where the
Yeah.
big key is, so.
I have a question, just that I hadn't realized before. So when an ADU is initially established, it gets its own address?
Typically, yeah. I don't think it's a requirement. A lot of times people request a separate address. But I think we would prefer that just for emergency service, access and being able to identify where it's at.
And would it normally be like, if the house is 320, the ADU would be 320A or something like that, or would it?
A lot of
so
it
that you don't
depends,
mess up the-
yeah. Well, a lot of it
Yeah.
depends on whether or not there's available addresses.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So sometimes in high-density areas, you'll run into the issue where there won't be you have odd on one side, even on the other, and you'll run into an issue where there won't be an available address, and then in that circumstance, the post office has requirements about what they want you to do. So that's what we do. We used to do these halves, I was in an address when I first moved here, it was like 905 and a half. And the post office hates that. I don't know how many packages I didn't get delivered, because even when you enter, buy something online and you enter your address, they hate the half. I mean,
Yeah.
you almost have to spell it out.
Wow, yeah, I can see how that would be a problem.
And then the other one is the off-street parking. And this is a requirement that's unique to Moscow. And just when we reviewed and amended our off-street parking requirements a couple years ago, we reviewed, a ton of other off-street parking codes. And Moscow's was still the only code that required a covered parking space. So the way it reads right now is that each off-street parking space has to conform to our standards. So this is assuming that you're building like a single-family dwelling or a duplex. So R1 zone is kind of our lowest density residential zone in town. Single-family dwellings are only allowed. And it says that if the required off-street parking for a single-family dwelling is not provided in a garage or carport, then such space shall be so located that at a future date it may be covered by a garage structure in accordance with the provisions of the zoning code and the city code. So that's 2 spaces that are required to be covered by a garage or a carport, or located in an area where they could be. So essentially what that means is that they need to meet setback requirements. So in the future, somebody could build a garage or a carport in order to cover those. And then it goes on to say that in all zoning districts, if the required off-street parking for single or two-family dwellings is not provided in a garage or carport, then at least one such space per dwelling unit shall be located that at a future date it may be covered by a garage structure in accordance with the code. So, so any other zone, and what we require people to do is just identify, most single-family and duplexes, people build garages, and they have those, but in the instances where they don't, are we really worried about whether or not we're preserving an option for them to be able to cover that in the future? And so you get into an issue if say a property has maybe a couple single-family dwellings on it, they're laying out the parking, and then they're distinguishing on their site plan which parking spaces are going to be the future covered spaces or not. And it's just another layer that we haven't really found very useful in our requirements for off-street parking. It's really become less problematic because we've amended our accessory structure requirements. So if you have a accessory structure that's 200 square feet in size or less, you don't have any setbacks from your rear side property lines. So a lot of times when people have the parking off the alley, it's just a standard spot off the alley because they could build a 9 by, maybe 10 by 20 garage and it doesn't have a setback. So it was more problematic before when we had, 5-foot setback for those 200 square foot structures. And then they were forced to try to, have some flexibility and finagle a way to try to find an additional 5 feet in order to have the parking spot. So it was just one of these things that's been on our radar that we haven't really seen a whole lot of value in requiring. And we just in the review last couple years ago, there really hasn't been any other, this is really unique to Moscow. I haven't seen it anywhere else in any other codes. So just wanted to talk about whether you thought it was worthwhile keeping or whether or not we could just eliminate that provision.
Madam Chair, may I come and speak?
Is welcome, yeah.
Yeah, you are welcome. You can come to the table if you want, but you need to state your name and address, of course, for the record.
Catherine. Oh, Nils Peterson, 841 Travoy. I'm the director of the Moscow Affordable Housing Trust. And I came to speak to this issue because I would hope that you would remove this restriction. The smaller the lot, and I seek to use small lots, the more challenging it becomes to get the parking into a place on the lot where it could be covered. Creating the garage raises the value of the house in real estate terms. So it's working against, I think, our broader goal of creating affordable housing options. Especially when we start to talk about small unit kind of developments.
Yep.
So I would really hope, I sat on your side of the table and I thought, well, that's a nice amenity. But now sitting on this side as a developer, I say, well, let the developer figure that out. And if that's an amenity that makes sense in the market, then the developer will figure that out. And if it's not, and in the case of what I'm trying to do, you may recall the Vandal Drive project that we tried. We were trying to put a 3-unit on Vandal and Lincoln, I think. It's a funny wedge-shaped lot.
Yeah.
And the requirement to have a parking stall for each of the 3 units within the setbacks meant we couldn't do this. The middle unit failed. Topography, we weren't going to get a garage in there, or couldn't get around the back to get in, and so that was a specific example where that code requirement actually stopped us from doing a design that we wanted to do. You've heard of my rationales for the alley on the Paradise View plat. I think those all stand. That also solves this problem, but without the alley, which would have been a design by right, it would be awkward and difficult, but designed by right, then we would have faced exactly the same problem again of where do you park the cars and having to get one all the way onto the buildable part of inside the setbacks. So I would really hope that you would move to eliminate this.
So you mean that the presumption is that then people would park on the street?
No.
No, they park
I
on
would
the
love
side
you to
in the
eliminate the 2 on-site parking stalls, but that's not what's on the table. What's on the table is that one of those stalls must be inside the setbacks such that it could be covered. Or in the rear area, you might be able to.
Yeah,
So
whereas.
you're wasting
yeah.
20 feet right off the,
Yeah, or
setback.
whereas,
Yeah.
if you had 2 side-by-side spaces in the driveway in front of the house, then that would satisfy the requirement. But with this in place, one of those is required to meet setbacks. So you're almost forced into a tandem configuration at that point. And so that, I mean, we're accomplishing the same thing with that. We're designating 2 off-street parking spaces to keep cars off the street and for the residents. But we're just forcing this design for the houses.
Well, and practically, what percentage of people actually park their cars in their garages, or do they just have their stuff stored in their garages? So that may present another problem, where we have all their stuff. But no, anyway.
Right, so as you said, our current Southview project is tandem. The garage is, and the driveway has to be 20 feet long before the garage door, so the facade jogs around for the garages, and in that site it worked, but.
Thank you for that input, I think that's helpful. So would you like us to, I mean, does anybody have any objections to removing this restriction, really? Or should we direct Mike to move forward with?
Yeah, I'm convinced.
Okay. And don't leave, because the next item might interest you. I think, which, in terms of a continuing education discussion, I thought, well, what media have we not used? We have not used YouTubes. And instead of having people read articles or look at PowerPoint presentations. And so I started researching YouTubes, and then I thought, what about tiny homes, So I found a pretty awesome 1 hour and 6 minute YouTube about living tiny legally, and it's really about from developers' perspectives, from city planners' perspectives, from planning commissions, from government, et cetera, in a number of communities, how they've worked through their ordinances to allow tiny homes in different configurations, some as infill projects, and with the affordability dimension there as well, which is really interesting. So it's what I would maybe suggest, or what we had talked about, Mike and I had talked about, is maybe breaking it down into 2 1/2 hour, it's 1 hour and 6 minutes, so watching half of it essentially. It's the middle section is kind of blended together, so it's a little, the second and third part are kind of blended together, so it's a little hard to just totally segregate them into segments. But the first part is really focused more on allowing neighborhoods and PUDs, et cetera, and how that's done. And then the other one is really more about infill. So we could, spread the discussion over 2 meetings, if that sounds good to you.
Sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
But I thought it was pretty high quality. It had, tens of thousands of thumbs up and only like 50 thumbs downs. It's a good one. Yeah. And it's living tiny legally part 1. I have part 2 seemed less relevant, and it just came out. But anyway,
It seems my mind goes back to Bill Marshak in our life. We used to, years ago, we had a commission member who was always wishing there were ways to do smaller things, smaller roads, smaller lots, to be able to make development affordable. And he felt like the regulations just made everybody, we have to have the road 36 feet wide, and then, you really didn't need that. If you start talking about tinier things, maybe the road could be different. And he used to talk about that a lot. Do you remember that?
Yes, I remember Bill.
And he laughed and isn't here anymore to have that point of view, but I think it's really a good one.
yeah.
I like the idea a lot. I think it's a good find. I'm always, I don't know exactly how it should be in our city, but I've found myself in my bike riding on the Hay Street one way, the little Hay Street Extension Street. And I feel like a lot of those people on that little street are happy people. I mean, clearly you don't have big trucks going by your house because it's a little tiny one-way thing.
but it serves the purpose. The guys that need to pick up the garbage can go down the street, but it's kind of special. And as I ride my bike in different times of the day, people who are, I can't talk to my neighbors across Hay Street because you have to shout. You'd have to have a megaphone to talk to your neighbor across the street. These people can whisper to their neighbor across the street. So I think
Well, and
there's
also,
good things.
Pritchard's
Yeah,
tiny
his
house development,
yeah,
essentially from the
exactly.
1920s, is
That's
on
right.
8th and Hayes.
Yeah.
And the Hayes,
Yeah, right, yeah.
actually
Appleton,
Hayes
yeah.
goes right by that.
Right,
I
right.
ride by that every day.
But it also ties into the garage deal, because if you're trying to create tiny homes, whether as infills, almost in an ADU capacity, or as on existing lots, or in a configuration, and you all of a sudden have to build all these garages everywhere, you've defeated the purpose
So it
of.
does fit into
Yeah.
your
Yeah, yeah.
affordable housing, doesn't
Right,
it?
right,
Mills?
Well, I think it's a compelling film because it really also, it has a lot of the people, the market, the people who want tiny homes and why, and what their justification is. And I think, so when should we set, what do we have coming up in, I'm gonna miss the next, I'm gonna be calling into the next P and Z.
Okay.
But we could, and Rob's gonna be running it. Do you wanna wait until the October meetings?
Really up to you. I don't
Yeah.
think we have.
Seems
a
like
lot
to
of
try and
pressing
just
things.
fit it in when we have nights like
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We could certainly take an extra
Right,
half an
right,
hour
right.
and really have a good learning experience.
Do you see a lot coming up at the, in
We could probably-
October?
I don't think so. I think we probably just have a few final plats and that's about it.
Okay. Okay, so we'll,
So are we gonna view it here and then discuss it?
I think the idea would be to view a half,
Yeah.
literally
Yeah,
half of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then maybe save some time to discuss, and then the next week, or the next meeting, do the second half.
Excellent. Excellent.
So that would take, 40, 45 minutes total. So we have to find an agenda that's open enough for that, so, yeah.
Wendy,
Yes,
excuse me, have you talked to Rob about chairing the next meeting?
I have.
Okay, because I had down in my notes that he was maybe gonna be gone.
I-
Maybe that's old info.
He's gone tonight.
Okay.
Okay, and he,
I had
yeah.
both, but
Well, oh,
next
he
time was a
did?
maybe, so if you've talked to him recently, it's.
Oh, okay, I better
Recently.
double check, but I think he said he would be able to, so. Okay. I'm gonna be calling in, but it's hard to cheer off from the phone. Yeah, so, okay, so the next item, Joel, do you have an update on the Transportation
Transportation
Commission?
Commission will meet at this table at 4 o'clock tomorrow. I've been remiss in it because I've not looked at the agenda, but it is available on the city website.
Okay. Any announcements from anybody? We just want to welcome Ann back, and I know you've had a hard journey, and welcome back.
Everything's good, yeah, thank
Good,
you.
good. I should have done that at the beginning, I apologize. Anyway, okay, meeting adjourned. Thanks.